Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, October 4th. This week, war in the Middle East. For almost a year, the Biden administration led efforts to ensure that the terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel last October 7th, almost a year ago, would not escalate into a regional war. The actors in the region, unfortunately, appear to have had different ideas. After Hamas has killed more than 1,000 Israelis, Hezbollah launched rocket attacks against northern Israel, and soon Houthis in Yemen joined by targeting shipping lanes in the Red Sea, and Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Iraq started to attack U.S. and other forces. Israel and the United States responded to these attacks in an effort to convince Iran to hold back their militias and their resistance forces from further escalating. It worked, sort of, but it doesn't look like it's working any longer. In the last few weeks, the wars in the regions have all escalated. In Lebanon, on the West Bank, in Yemen, and most importantly now with Iran. After Israel killed the Hezbollah leadership in a series of attacks and then invaded Lebanon, Iran responded by launching some 200 missiles without warning earlier this week. The region is on edge, awaiting an Israeli response that everyone knows is coming. So here to help sort out the week's events, to analyze what's happening and why, and what we can expect next, are three reporters who've been looking at these stories closely. Peter Spiegel, U.S. Managing Editor of Financial Times, Philip Stevens, Contributing Editor of Financial Times, and Nahal Toosi, Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent for Politico. Good morning, all. Good afternoon, Philip, for you in London. Nahal, it's been quite a week, but then it's been quite a year ever since we woke up on Saturday morning, October 7th, to hear the incredible terrorist attack that happened almost exactly a year ago. We tried to find a way for Israel to defend itself, but not to have the war escalate. We're now seeing missile attacks across the peninsula, and everyone is waiting for the next step. Help us sort of sort out why you think we are at this stage, particularly about what Iran has been trying to do and what it's trying to do now.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And I just want to preemptively apologize to viewers and listeners. I have the flu, and so I'm not going to be sounding as wonderful as usual. Look, I think that the Iranians in particular are in a very strange position, right? They, of course, have backed Hamas and Gaza and Hezbollah for a long time. But they didn't, from intelligence reports and others, it seems like they didn't know Hamas was going to launch the attack a year ago. And so ever since then, they have been trying to figure out how far to go to seem to be supportive of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah without entering into a straight-on war with Israel, which they worry would, of course, bring in the United States. And Hezbollah, in particular, has not made Iran's role easier. They, on October 8th, started launching rockets at Israel and in Israel's north. And that led the Israelis to evacuate some 60,000 people from their north. And they basically have felt like they've lost a stretch of territory in their north for a year. And so there have been diplomatic talks with Hezbollah for a year to try to get them to back off and the Israelis to be able to go back home, but that hasn't worked. And the Israelis, now that they've kind of, the war in Gaza is at a lower pace than it was before, they are like, look, we've had it. We want to get our people back home to the north. And so they have taken the war to Hezbollah. And in doing so, it has put Iran in an even tougher position. And there's another thing driving a lot of this, I think, which is that if you talk to any Israeli, like, from the beginning, they would say, we can't just deal with the symptoms of this. Hezbollah and Hamas are the symptoms. The real root of the problem is Iran. So there's always been a sense that they have to get Iran somehow to back down. And so now that they've gone after Hezbollah and had even more success than I think even they themselves, the Israelis, thought they would have, they have killed Hezbollah's leader. They have staged a number of attacks that have really humiliated Iran, who is supposed to be the patron of Hezbollah. And this has put Iran on the back foot to where it's like, look, our proxies are being decimated. We look really weak. We have to do something. And it's a question of what do we do that doesn't go too far, because the Iranians still, from what we can tell, don't want an all-out war. Now, we saw this kind of play out in April. There was another incident. It led Iran to attack Israel with hundreds of missiles. Israel and partners deflected those. We're sort of having a replay of that this time. But this time around, last time in April, after Iran did that, Israel staged a small strike back that kind of made a point, but which put a lid on that particular event. This time around, the Israelis have said, if Iran attacks us with missiles, which it did just the other day, we're going to strike back. So the question now is, how will Israel strike back? Will it be in a way that's overwhelming and which the Iranians feel they have to respond to, or can it be smaller and the Iranians can back down? And also in a more long-term vision for Iran, what does this mean strategically, right? So after, let's say that there is a way to contain this for now. Does this mean, though, that in the long run that the Iranians are going to think, you know what, we have to build that nuclear weapon. We have to build new proxies. We cannot let Israel make us look bad. And even if it's something that takes months or years or even decades, we're going to do this. So these are some of the questions I think the Iranians are asking themselves. And one last point I will make is, look, Iran has shown to a certain degree that it can restrain itself. After Israel killed Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran a few weeks back, Iran did not respond. And it was trying to see if there was a ceasefire and if that could come together. This time, though, after killing Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, I just think the Iranians felt like they had to do something. And now it all comes down to what Israel will do.
Nahal, can I ask you about that last little bit? Because you said two things, which I don't think are necessarily contradictory, but I just wanted to sort of push you a little bit on that. One, you said the Israeli move, both to attack Nasrallah and go into southern Lebanon was a feeling of enough already. We've waited a year. There's been all this bombing. We just have to stop it. But you also made the point that this is a symptom, not the cause. The cause is Iran. And I would argue that those are two separate things. One is we actually just want to regain our sovereignty over our northern territories. The other one is this is the chance. We now have to really go after Hezbollah and Iran to change the whole equation. I know this is unknowable, but I wonder if you have a thinking about whether the Israelis have made the jump that actually it's now or never. We need to actually really change the calculation and go after Iran to take them off the table. Or do you think it's still limited goals of just getting Hezbollah to stop firing to northern Israel?
I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think that it's gone beyond getting Hezbollah to stop firing at northern Israel. I think it's about, degrading Hezbollah as much as possible. And I think that's partly because the Israelis have had even more success than I think they realize that they've had. I don't think they are at the point where they are saying we're going to destroy Hezbollah completely the way they've kind of said about Hamas, right? I'm not sure they're there yet, but I think they want to deliver as much of a knockout punch to Hezbollah as they possibly can. But I don't think that they're at the stage yet where they're talking about regime change in Iran or anything remotely like that. It's more about establishing a certain level of deterrence with Iran. But I have to tell you, if you talk to Israelis, they always come back to this question of Iran being the ultimate head of the octopus, as they put it. And so when you say, well, are you going to go after the head? They're not quite willing to say that, but you just kind of wonder if in a year from now we're going to be having that conversation.
Philip, I bring you in here and just sticking for a second on Iran's strategy and the sort of the pickle they find themselves in. And they built this axis of resistance with Hezbollah at its core, really to deter, to spread their influence, number one, but then to deter Israel from attacking Iran. And Israel, by going after and destroying the deterrent, which is what it's trying to do with Hezbollah, is really putting Iran in an impossible position. I think, as Nahal rightly put it. And so, what do you think the debate is in Tehran between though, what are there factions? Are there different people thinking about it? We really now need to go after Israel full bore, or do we stop? Or how do you think they're looking at this?
Well, I think you can't detach, Iran's responses from perceptions of what Israel's intentions are, because that's the problem. And if you talk to European diplomats, and some of whom still have embassies there, and they'll tell you that what worries Iran is that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is finally going to achieve his long-term ambition. One of Netanyahu's ambitions, and I remember visiting Washington 2010, 2011, talking to Obama administration officials, and they'd say, Netanyahu only wants to talk to the president about one thing: bombing Iran, bombing the nuclear facilities. There is a perception in Europe, and I think probably in Tehran, that the grand strategy here, or at least for Netanyahu, is to pull America into a strike against Iran's nuclear installations, to, if you like, escalate sufficiently whereby the US feels obliged to support it in striking those instances. And that, I think, is what the Iranians are trying to gauge. Are they on a slide to a war in which brings America in? And I think one of the explanations for Iran holding back somewhat in recent months has been to signal very clearly, we don't want that. We are not looking for a big confrontation with the US, or war with Israel, or a confrontation with the US. They're now, I think, beginning to think, is this Netanyahu's strategy? Is it to pull the US? And that makes it very, very hard. How do they deter against that? I mean, I think, in the long term, of course, it encourages them to accelerate their nuclear program. In the short term, how can they be restrained, but also keeps, as was said, keep some credibility with its proxies in the region? And I think, it's very, very difficult. So far, we've seen, I think, Iran being very, very calibrated in its responses. Even the rockets, a few days ago, they were very clear to say these were aimed at military targets. They weren't aimed at any civilian. So, it'll, in the short term, it'll depend on how Israel responds. In the slightly shorter to medium term, the question is Netanyahu determined to keep pushing and pushing and pushing until Iran feels it has to respond with real determination, and then America is pulled in?
Yeah. Ivo, can I jump in there just on one thing before we get too much down the U.S. role? Because I do think your question implies something it's worth talking about, which is internal dynamics within Iran. And I think sometimes we gloss over that because it is an autocracy run by a religious elite, but actually it is much more, there are many more voices that act on the Iranian regime than perhaps in some of these other regional sheikdoms and particularly in the Gulf. There was an election in Iran. I know it was set up. We did have an election where a moderate, quote unquote, was elected. There is some, particularly in the cosmopolitan areas of Tehran, who get annoyed and are rather upset with a regime that is constantly trying to pick wars with Israel and funding things like Hamas and Hezbollah, and would like to actually get the sanctions lifted because there is there's an economic problem going on right now in Iran. And actually, before this all happened, if you remember, the new Iranian president came to New York and went to the UN General Assembly and talked about that's his biggest priority, is lifting sanctions. And so I think the dynamic within Iran is worth exploring because there are constraints on the regime itself. That some of the reason it's calibrating itself may not just be to prevent a war with the U.S. and Iran, but also to make sure there's, it wasn't that long ago we had the Green Revolution in Iran, right? There is the need to maintain domestic support for what it is doing because the entire Iranian population is not all that supportive of this adventurism, for lack of a better word, that the regime has participated in Lebanon and in the West Bank and in Gaza.
But Peter, I think the danger is that just as the war against Hezbollah has solidified support for
that's exactly right.
Netanyahu in Israel, attacks by
Absolutely.
Israel tend to solidify support for the regime. It's the old external enemy play.
Absolutely.
And certainly you hear European diplomats who are there saying, you're not hearing much protest against, the sort of the response to Israel. You're not hearing people, out on the streets saying, no, we shouldn't be firing missiles at Israel.
I would just voice a small note of dissent. I think the Iranian population, for the most part, I don't think it's maybe 20 years ago, it might have had a more nationalist streak, support, whoever's in charge against an external enemy. But I think they're so, for the most part, sick of this regime that many of them would probably be neutral at best. They wouldn't necessarily rally to support this regime, even if it was under attack. It's a different mindset now among Iranians, I would argue.
Yeah, I think just to bring two strands together, and then I want to jump over and sort of get into the Israel piece in more detail. To bring two strands together. One, I was struck in response to Philip's, I think, excellent points, that the Iranians announced, when they announced that they did, after they did the 200 missiles or so, they said, we were restrained and we didn't respond. And that's because the United States promised us that there would be a ceasefire. And remember, the U.S., again, worked very hard to try to get a ceasefire in Gaza, which would have ended the war with Hezbollah, et cetera, after the Haniya assassination in Tehran. And their interpretation, which is interesting because that seems to be an interpretation a lot of people, was the fact that Israel struck Hezbollah and struck Nasrallah. They see not as a Israel defying the United States, but as the U.S. supporting Israel. And that, in fact, in some ways, they have concluded that their restraint strategy didn't work because the U.S. and Israel are determined to go after them. I think at least that's one possibility. And I think on the debate internally, I was struck that they announced that there was a Supreme Council meeting after the Nasrallah killing to discuss what their responses were. And the president was still hoping that there would be, moderation. Of course, then he came out on Sunday night with a pretty tough statement after that meeting to say that. But it seemed to be there was still a debate internally in the leadership about whether they continue sort of the restrained policy or whether to find a different way. And it looks like the IRGC really won that fight internally, which you would expect. Which raises Philip the question of Israel and sort of what's interesting is all the reporting out of Israel suggests that Netanyahu was the one who hesitated at each turn. He hesitated, on October 8th when Gallant and the IDF wanted to go after Hezbollah first. He hesitated apparently about whether to strike Nasrallah, I don't know what he's hesitating about now. And yet, it seems to be that we've moved from a policy of defending Israel to saying, let's solve all of our problems with the military force. And that you have most of the population sort of saying, yeah, we don't want another October 7, but we don't want what's happening in the north. And why not go after the controlling interest, which is Iran? How do you read it, sort of the evolution of Israeli thinking, remembering that, the strategy against Hamas hasn't worked?
Well, I think, whether the hesitations were tactical or strategic hesitations is a question, and I would tend to go for the first. I mean, I think that my own view is that Netanyahu has been remarkably consistent, throughout since 2009, since he came back in 2009. There have been three things: I've got to retain my own position in power, whatever that means. I've got to destroy any residual hopes of a two-state solution, and I've got to persuade the US to take on Iran with us, or to help us take on Iran. And I think those threads run through his whole his whole career. And I think they're there now. I mean, I think it's clear, and for him tactically going after Hezbollah, despite the said hesitations, has sort of taken. Remember, only a few weeks ago there were huge demonstrations against Netanyahu, against the Hamas strategy. He's buried all that, as it were, in the sense that, as you say, everyone can get together and say the strategy against Hezbollah, being tough on Hezbollah is the right thing to do. But clearly, there is this sense, I think, of whether it's just Netanyahu or others, but of a sort of emerging grand strategy that says we have got our opportunity to remake the ground. I mean, it's not going to make Israel. Israel's fought and won so many wars that were supposed to make it safe. I don't think this, whatever comes next is going to make it safe. But for a good while. But, this, I think, for a lot of Israelis, and predominantly for Netanyahu, if this ends with Iran saying, okay, well, the only way is for us now is to actually not be a sort of nuclear threshold power, become a nuclear power, that then changes again everything. So it's I think we don't know against it. They've been amazingly successful against Hezbollah. Are they going to continue to be? We don't know. I mean, if Israeli casualties mount up on the ground, will it still be as popular as it were to attack? But I think that I think there is the framework of a grand strategy there. I'm still in the camp with the former Israeli President Ehud Olmert that says, in the end, you don't solve these things. You don't get security through wars.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, in the end, I don't disagree with you at all on the three elements of Netanyahu's consistency. I think that's right, but it does raise this fundamental question, which the Hamas strategy exposed, which if force is the only answer, and you have no political strategy within which you embed force, how does this end, Peter?
Well, I mean, this gets back to the U.S. policy as well, and I'm trying to think of a way to frame this, because before we went on air, it's clear to me we disagree on this exactly where the Biden administration sits. But I think it gets to this very point, right? You do have, I would argue, in Jake Sullivan in particular, who negotiated the Iran deal during the Obama administration, an element of U.S. policy that believes just what Philip said.
Who initiated the Obama
Who initiated? Yeah, sorry. Yes, you're right. That just what Philip said, that only through negotiation and bringing Iran back into the family of nations, or however you want to describe it, will this resolve itself. And actually, we believe that there is, as I said before, there are elements within Iranian society that, if you can sort of loosen the militants' hold of the society, would become a little bit more moderate and actually shape Iranian behavior in the region. And the problem is, what we have seen, and I still think that is Biden's policy. Again, I think a couple of you on this show will disagree with me. This because obviously Amos Hochstein and Brett McGurk are a little bit more hardline in this regard. I still think that is what U.S. policy is aiming to do, which is, let's get the ceasefire in place, get everyone around the table, and try to develop to establish a lasting peace that way. The problem is Netanyahu doesn't want to play ball. And I again, before we came on, I related a conversation I had with Brent Scowcroft back during the Obama years, and his criticism of Obama was, every American president is going to have to pick a fight with Israel at some point, right? Carter really could not stand Menachem Begin. George H.W. Bush really could not get along with Shamir. Obviously, Obama had his issues with Netanyahu, but you pick the fight at the end, not at the beginning. You embrace at the beginning so that you get the Israelis' trust, and then when push comes to shove, you say, stop it, do this. And I think that's the path that Biden tried to do, right? He flew to, again, we're at the anniversary, he flew very immediately to Ben Gurion, he embraced Bibi, he said, we're behind you. There was that warning, don't do what we did after September 11th, which rings in my ears now, because it's in many ways what the Israelis have done. And I think there was a belief that sometime around now, they would say, okay, stop, and Netanyahu has not. This is where frankly, I think we have seen the U.S. becomes somewhat impotent in its ability to control Netanyahu. And we've heard all this briefing over the last 24, 48, 72 hours. Oh, we convinced the Israelis to do only an limited incursion to southern Lebanon. Like, first of all, I don't believe that. And if Bibi has told the administration that, I think he's lying. So I do not believe the Americans have been encouraging, enthusiastic about the Nasrallah attack, which frankly was not briefed the Americans beforehand. I think what we have seen is a real diminution in the ability of Biden to shape Israeli affairs, because Netanyahu knows that, particularly for domestic political reasons, Biden cannot say no to Israel. And we've even seen, Philip will know this better than I, there was a bit of the new Labor government came in, and there was a bit of, I'm not sure we can give weapons to Israel anymore because of international law issues. And there was a backlash in the UK on that, never mind in the US, which is much more pro-Israel in terms of polity than the UK is. So I think Netanyahu has played the Biden administration, and they've run that the White House has really run out of cards to play at this point. I think the interests of the two nations are diverging. I think the U.S. does want this to stop, does want a ceasefire, and does not want a regional war. Where at this point, again, and now why I asked you the question is, I'm not sure Israel wants that anymore. I do think Netanyahu, perhaps being dragged by his radical rightist cabinet members, is moving in a direction now. This is the time we solve all our problems and we do it militarily. And that, to me, is really problematic, particularly for long-term U.S.-Israeli relations.
I'm just going to disagree on the. Can I just disagree on the UK? Because I think the balance of opinion on the UK is not that the government was wrong to impose some pretty weak limits on some components. I think the balance of opinion in the UK is that there should have been a total arms embargo.
Fair enough.
And I think there is a view among European diplomats as well. It's not that the US, and I've heard a very senior European diplomat, not from the UK, say so. It's not that the US doesn't have leverage. It's that Biden isn't prepared to use the leverage.
Right.
And the leverage is not saying let's shut down all arms, but just the schedule of deliveries. You can do all sorts of things. And the European view, they may be wrong, but the European view, I think, is that Biden has chosen not to use the leverage he has.
A lot of issues on the table. Nahal, just jump in let's because you wanted to come in on this.
My sense is that there's splits within the Biden administration that, to be honest, the State Department's basically cut out. It's all been happening at the White House. It's Brett McGurk. It's Amos Hochstein now because of Lebanon. I can't figure out what Jake Sullivan believes on a lot of this. I mean, I think it's very hard to tell. He plays his cards close to his vest. And I think it's also worth, and I think the sense of Amos and Brett is that getting rid of Hezbollah is a good thing. Just like the sense of the entire Biden administration was that getting rid of Hamas to the extent possible is a good thing. I can't stress this enough. I think a lot of times people are like, oh, they wanted a ceasefire and the U.S., was getting played by Israel and all this stuff. And I'm like, actually, I know this. Like, they wanted to get rid of Hamas. They support that goal. And I'm pretty sure they would support Israel if it could carry out an operation that degrades Hezbollah to a significant degree, but which leaves it at that. One last thing I will just mention is, all of these groups have agency and authority on their own, be it Israel, U.S., Hamas, Hezbollah. Yes, there's links, there's patronage, there's ties, there's influence. But at the end of the day, the Houthis don't always listen to the Iranians. And there's just this frustration when I listen to analysts where they're like, well, Iran told them to do this. And it's like, a lot of these groups act on their own without necessarily taking orders from anyone.
Well, and that's true for the Israelis and the United States for sure. Although there is this perspective that the U.S. can just click his fingers and things would change. A lot of interesting points that I just let's see if we can pull the strings on. First of all, Nahal, do you agree that the Israelis have basically decided that now is the time to, quote, solve their problem in the way that Philip put it? That is, there's this opportunity. They did better against Hezbollah than they perhaps dreamt of. They won, and they now see an opportunity. in a never again way, in the way that Michael Oren says, this is just what Israel is about. The only way to get security is to destroy your enemies, and that you now have an opportunity to do that with Iran. The question is, can you do it alone, or do you need to drag the U.S. in order to get it after the nuclear program, which is those two are different. How do you agree with that?
I don't think they've decided that they can do that with Iran. I think that they can go, like, they want to go as far as they can with Hezbollah, and Hamas, obviously. But I just think their sense is, hey, if we know that this guy who could be the successor to Hassan Nasrallah is going to be at this building, and we just happen to be flying by with a bomb, why not drop it on? I mean, at this point, what do you have to lose? And I think that there's people in the White House who actually agree. Why not? It's not like these groups are going to suddenly change their mind about Israel and be like, okay, fine, we're totally cool with you. Like, I can understand the Israeli perspective that, there's no reasoning with some of these organizations. Every time they've, fought them in the past, and they've struck a deal to ceasefire or whatever, these groups have simply built up and come back even stronger and become an even bigger threat. So, but going after Hezbollah is very different than going after Iran. It's a very different thing.
And there was a question, I think, Eva, that you were talking to Philip about whether this is a strategic pause and why there's a strategic pause right now. I mean, part of it may just be yesterday's Rosh Hashanah, but I do think this is where, I mean, to Nahal's point, Israel on its own can doesn't need a huge amount of direct American support to go after, Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran, particularly since the Iranians are saying, if we see Americans' fingerprints on this, we start attacking American bases in Syria and Iraq, they do the Americans on side. And frankly, that then impacts the U.S. presidential election, right? I mean, there's all this debate about, oh gosh, the world on fire and Trump's try to capitalize on this. Americans don't care about foreign policy, to be honest with you, unless Americans start coming back in body bags. And if we start seeing the Iranians retaliating against U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq, Jenny barred the door. That suddenly becomes a domestic political story. What is it? 4 weeks before an election, and so I guess I think that is why right now we're seeing this pause before Israel reacts, because this is where Biden really needs to intervene. And I think in terms of using his leverage, I suspect this is what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean the difficult. I mean, I think you're right, and Peter, I saw your column today in the FT on sort of the electoral impact of this as well. I think you're right, and I think Netanyahu knows this. He knows that for the next 4.5 weeks, he has all the leverage he needs to do whatever he wants. Because the reality is, whatever Biden wants, whatever Harris wants, or whatever Trump wants, the one thing they cannot do in the next 4.5 weeks is to leverage the military assistance that we are providing to Israel in order to try to inhibit Israel from either going after Hezbollah or Hamas or Iran, for that matter. I think politically, Netanyahu knows this, and I think, Philip, to the point of the European diplomat who said that the U.S. has leverage, it just needs to use it. I think that's true, but it can't use it until November 5th.
Well, that was very striking.
And Bibi knows that.
It was very striking when the president was asked the other day about, and showed his support for, the attack on Hezbollah, was asked about the Iranian nuclear installations, and he just said, no, we're not having that.
But he said, but remember, he said no to bombing Rafah. He said no to invading Rafah. He said no to going after Hezbollah. He said no so many times.
But to Peter's point, none of those things had any direct impact on the United States. American planes, even if they're just refueling the Israeli jets or guarding them, being involved in a bombing attack on Iranian nuclear installations, that really is war. That changes everything.
Yeah, and I think that the one thing they can do is to refuse to participate in bombing, and I think Biden will. But I'm struck by the fact that if the reporting is correct, the Israelis used 80 bombs to go after Nasrallah. In order to go really, really deep and through concrete. And if they can do that there, what is stopping them from doing that in Natanz? And the question is, do they actually have the capacity, or do they think they have the capacity, which is the same thing, that they don't need the United States to target the nuclear facilities?
Well, I think the military people would say you'd need 800 bombs for Natanz or more. So can you physically carry and drop that number of bombs, 1,000 kilometers or so across, where you're having to refuel your planes? Do you have enough bombers and enough fighters to defend those bombers? Do you have, a powerful enough bomb? I mean, I think the US is the only country that's got this. I can't remember what it's called now. This sort of super.
Moab.
The mother of all bombs.
Moab,
the one that we dropped in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And I think they may be wrong, but the European view is that an attack on Iran's nuclear installations is not practically feasible without considerable American.
This was my point. I mean, all you have to do is look at geography, right? I mean, southern Beirut is a whole lot closer than Natanz, and you need logistically, just look at the map, you need logistically support from your closest ally to get any of this stuff done. And I just think that's where the leverage comes in here.
I'm going to voice a note of dissent. I think maybe we're underestimating the Israeli capabilities to a degree. I mean, look, they probably have the weapons. I mean, enough bombs. We've been giving them bombs for a long time. These guys have managed to infiltrate Iran's security services like incredibly well. I mean, like they have people on the inside helping them put bombs in like where Ismail Haniyeh is staying in his apartment. Like, I mean, come on, like
in his bathroom, apparently.
They take out Iranian scientists. I don't know. You guys are like,
I guess my point.
They can't do it without Americans. I'm like, I'm pretty sure the Israelis have been thinking to themselves, how can we make it to where we are able to do this without the Americans?
I'm sure that's right, Nahal. But I guess my other point is beyond the capabilities. Again, look at the geography. They will have to overfly Iraq. There will be some place where there are American forces in place. And are the Israelis really going to risk an Iranian retaliation on American forces without weighing that with Biden, and Biden saying no and saying screw you, we're going to do it anyway? I think there is a logistical support issue that you may be right on. I'm more skeptical than you are, but there's also a geopolitical element here, which is you are by definition drawing American forces into this war if you overfly these regions, because the Iranians have already warned on that.
Right, but are the Iranians going to risk attacking American forces? I mean, that's the other question, right? Like it's just there's the risk of miscalculation. I think we can agree on this is incredibly high, right? At every level. I mean, I just look back, one of the things I look back on this whole year and I kind of wonder how things would be different is back like before, what led to the April bombing, the April attack from Iran on Israel, right? Israel attacked an Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus, Syria, taking out a bunch of Iranian commanders. Now, if they had attacked these Iranian commanders somewhere else in Syria, Iran probably would not have responded the way it did. But they attacked a consular building, or what Iran said was a consular building. It was like attacking Iranian soil. So that was a calculation they made that led the Iranians to say, we have to respond. And they did. And you kind of go back and you wonder if they had just done it somewhere else, or if they hadn't done it, where would we be right now? And so we're talking about this stuff, and it's weird because I agree and disagree with all of you, which is kind of
it's probably the Middle East, yeah.
Right. But I mean, this is the thing. I think the Israelis have managed to surprise us on a number of levels. And here's one thing I will say: like, if they do attack Iran, it doesn't matter who's in the White House, they're going to support Israel.
Yep.
I
think Nahal is right. I think actually I do think that the Israeli, whether right or wrong, I think the Israelis believe they're in the driver's seat, and that they can determine. Ehud Barak and others have said that, in fact, don't underestimate. This is before this. the ability of the Israelis to do serious damage to the Iranian nuclear program. And he said that, and has been saying that for quite a while. I don't underestimate that they can do serious damage to the Israeli program without us. They have missiles too. They can go that they can use in a variety of forms. It may not be destroy the entire program, but it will put it back. And by the way, that's what they did with the Osirak reactor in 1981. It's what they did with the Syrian nuclear program, which they did destroy back in whenever it was in the 2000s. And I think they look at having options. I mean, the other option we haven't talked about, which has huge implications for the elections, is the oil facilities, which they can certainly take out. And interestingly enough, when Biden didn't say anything about the oil facilities, and Sullivan has been talking about, quote, severe consequences. You do have this sense that the U.S. is no longer in control of what is happening in the region, and you have this sense. And Nahal, you're probably right that Brett McGurk and Amos and others don't mind and I think Biden doesn't mind that Nasrallah is not long living anymore, and that Hezbollah is weakened, but they're no longer in charge. They're no longer able to control what's happening, and you have this sense in Israel with the Israeli leadership that they do think they're in charge, and that, if you look at Bibi, after a year in which he was declared politically dead, he's back. He's more popular than anybody else. He probably could win an election right now. He got a larger majority with Gideon Saar joining the government. He's now at 68. He's pretty strong, and that doesn't strike me as a recipe for restraint at this point.
That was exactly my point. The other thing I'll just point out about yesterday's comments, I mean, again, to think things through a domestic political lens. Obviously, Americans dying is a restraint, but we saw West Texas Intermediate and Brent crude go up 3% yesterday. Right, yeah. This has been the biggest issue in the campaign: inflation, and suddenly over the last basically month and a half, we've had a benign inflation environment. Fed's cutting rates. Kamala Harris can say, "Hey, all these complaining about high costs, we've dealt with it." If suddenly we're paying $5-6 a gallon here in the U.S., that is going to impact the vote in November. And I do find it odd that Biden allowed that just to go out there without walking it back yesterday.
Well, and by the way, Bibi Netanyahu knows what's happening in the elections, and he knows that inflation is an issue, and he knows that oil prices may be part of it. And so since he has a stake in this election, it's pretty clear. At least he thinks he has a stake in this election.
And just to follow that up, Ivo, there is a supposition amongst some in the Biden administration that he knows all too well. And actually, if he could stick it to Biden and by extension Harris, he gets the guy he wants, which is Trump, who is much more overtly pro Netanyahu, certainly than the gang currently in the White House. And that is what really kind of is always in the back of the minds, I think, of many in the White House, is this guy just wants Trump in, and he'll do anything to make sure that happens.
I think that's you articulated openly what I was suggesting, but without getting there. In the last minute and a half, let's. I think our listeners. I mean, this has been a really fascinating discussion, great discussion, hard issue, but it covered a lot of. Give us our Philip, starting with you. Give us our best guess, your best guess, what you think Israel is going to do in response. I mean, we have to assume it's going to do something, or maybe nothing, whatever. Maybe it's nothing. But in response, Rosh Hashanah ends at sundown tonight. In fact, it's pretty close to ending in Israel right now, given the time difference. What do you expect, Philip?
I'm not going to predict what Netanyahu's going to decide. What I'd say is I think we're in a period up until the election, if not beyond it as well, depending on the outcome, of very, very severe danger. And we've seen escalation. We haven't seen war across the Middle East. I think we're in real danger now of seeing war across the Middle East if Mr. Netanyahu isn't restrained.
Peter.
I'm going to be somewhat optimistic for the reason I articulated, that I do think at this point the Americans have a vote and they are very nervous about both American troops getting involved and the price of oil. It's going to be like for like. We can argue the Iranians attacked military sites. They tried to go after the Mossad headquarters. I think it will be attack on military or military type targets within Iran, launch sites, other command and control sites. I don't think it's going to be the oil infrastructure. I don't think it's going to be the nuclear infrastructure. And I wonder if that may actually, because we see it as like for like, may actually end this episode. And I'm going to hope that anyway.
Nahal, last word to you.
I think Israel will carry out a limited strike on an Iranian oil facility. And then I think there is a possibility the Iranians might just take it and move on. Maybe I'm being fanciful, but we'll see.
Well, I hope that Peter and Nahal is right, but I fear that Philip's sense of dread is perhaps politically more realistic. I do think that Netanyahu has every reason to escalate now. There's very little restraint, and there's very little that we can do. I don't see Biden saying, "You do that, you're on your own." I don't think he can do that in the next 5 weeks.
It's a war already, right? It's a war now, right?
Of course it is. I mean, it is.
Wait,
it is a real.
is it like a diet war, or like is it just like a...
No, it's. I mean, the war has 6 fronts. It's Hamas. It's Hezbollah. It's the Palestinian Jihad and Hamas in the West Bank. It's Houthis. It's Iran, and it's Syria. And it's happening all over, and it is Iran against Israel. That is the war that's happening. It's been playing out for a long time. It's just at some point it's going to be Tehran against Tel Aviv, and we're pretty darn close again to that.
That's the danger.
Yeah, that's exactly
Tehran
right.
Against Tel Aviv.
When you fight war through proxies, it's one thing. When you do it directly, it's quite another thing. With that really great, wonderful, optimistic, and glorious ending, I want to thank all 3 of you for really a terrific conversation, enlightening to many. It leaves us with more questions, but the Middle East always does. Nahal Toosi of Politico, Peter Spiegel of the Financial Times, and Philip Stevens of many things beyond the Financial Times, including the European University Institute in Florence and a wonderful Substack author, Inside Outside, and soon to be author of a new book on Anglo-Irish relations. Wonderful to have all of you on the show. Nahal, feel better. You did great, given the flu that you had. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.